Good evening, everyone. I'm Michael Ulrich, director of NYU Washington, D.C., and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's film screening of Last Man in Aleppo. We are thrilled to partner with One Journey for the second of their three-part film series about the global refugee crisis, its tragic scale and impact. We've been pleased to sponsor other events and speakers who have illuminated the plight of refugees and provided insights about how to support their struggle. Several of our courses also include discussions about the refugee crisis and proposed solutions, a topic made even more timely given the current state of our political system. Please join me in welcoming Molly Bao, this evening's organizer for One Journey, whose mission includes amplifying refugee voices and enhancing public awareness of refugee talents and contributions. Welcome, Molly.
Michael, thank you, and thank you to New York University. These guys are pros. They are total rock stars, and we are glad to come back for round two of our One Journey events. But before I dive in, who's new? Who has never been to a One Journey event before? Raise your hand. What? That is amazing. Well, thank you for joining us. We are a scrappy group of volunteers who do this on night and weekends, and our entire mission started off last year. And we got together and we said, we've got to do something about the narrative that is going south, and not in a good way, about refugees. We're going to take it back. We're going to celebrate the talents, the tenacity, the heart and soul of the people who are forced to flee their homes and seek a better life, a different life, and we want to create a welcoming society here. And so we do that through events like this that engage, that create awareness, that seek to bring people closer to understanding, that might create empathy, but surely that will create an open embrace in our communities. And every year we have a killer festival. Every year being we've been around for 1 year, so we're going on our second year here. This is the second event of year 2. And so we had this huge, beautiful festival last year. We had 4,000 plus people come, and we had song and dance and music and art, the languages of humanity, because that's what we are all about, is understanding each other's humanity and seeing each other in our cultures, the commonalities. And so this is one of many awareness events that we do leading up to that festival. We have a 3-part film series. We're going to have a wine and gala. There will be arts and music and all of that. I'll tell you more about it through emails. Sign up on our listserv. Become a volunteer if you care about issues like this. We've got copious opportunities for you to lend a hand and get involved. And what we do is we connect people who are interested in opening their arms to new Americans. We connect them to the ecosystem of communities and organizations that are working for resettlement, ESL, that are working to help bridge the cultural divides. So we're a channel. We'll help route you to whatever it is that strikes your fancy in terms of your personal passion. So that's a little bit about us. Let's turn to what we're going to talk about tonight. Tonight is not an easy thing to experience. We are going to watch an award-winning film that Oscar nominated for Best Academy Award for a documentary. It is a tough portrait of the civilians on the front line of the Syrian crisis. It's about a group of Syrian volunteers called the White Helmets who try to pull people out of the rubble and try to run and help when there are no emergency services to provide help. And this particular microcosm we're going to see tonight is about Aleppo. We have an incredible moderator, Ed Beater, who's from Aleppo. His high school is actually featured in this film, and he's going to tee up a panel who's going to unpack what you're going to see tonight. But I just want to give you some contextualizing statistics. There have been more than 500,000 people killed in the 9 years of the Syrian civil war. That's more than the U.S. experienced in casualties in World War II. There are more than 5.5 million Syrian refugees, people who have fled Syria. There are more than 6 million displaced within Syria. This is a crisis that is roiling, and it's confusing. Are the Kurds our allies? Russian, Iran, Turkish influences? It's a mix, it's a jumble, and what's lost in that is the human suffering and the civilians who are behind and in this mix and milieu. And we're going to take a look at them, and we're going to talk about it afterwards with just an incredible panel, and I'm so excited to have them here today. Ed's going to tell you more about that. But Without further ado, let me tee this up for you. Unlike in most theaters, please take out your phones. Please tweet. Please tell your friends all about this experience. Please share on all of your social platforms. And if you like what you see, these are incredible guests. We're going to talk more about that. If you like what you see, support us. We are on CrowdRise. Get involved. Volunteer with us. We're going to reach out with plenty of opportunities for volunteering throughout the year. So lots of opportunities to lend a hand. We could not have done tonight without New York University. Thanks, guys, for having us here again. And Kava, if you had some delicious hummus, and Artisan and Vine, if you had any wine. Thank you so much to our sponsors who make things like this happen. So without further ado, friends, I'm going to roll tape, as they say, and we are going to watch the film. Polly, could you bring it up for us?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Ed Bitter. Actually, it's hard to speak after those emotional movie, but we will try our best. I would like to introduce our panel to come and join us here. First, Suzanne Sahlul, who came from Chicago to be with us here. She's the founder and the executive director of the Syrian Community Network. Under her leadership, the network has grown significantly to become a strong voice for refugees and immigration rights, and a national community-based resettlement organization working in partnership with local and national refugees, immigration rights, and faith-based organizations. She's a passionate human rights advocate and has received UNICEF's Chicago Humanitarian Award and Illinois Coalition for Immigration and Refugee Rights Annual Humanitarian Award. Also, I would like to invite Jayna Mason, who has worked in the refugee arena since 1983. She's the Senior Advisor for External Relations and Government Affairs at the Washington, D.C. Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugee. She represents the agency's interests with the U.S. government, particularly the State Department and the Congress, and the non-government organizations. Prior to joining UNSCR in 2008, Jayna was the director of Government Relations and Advocacy in the International Rescue Committee, IRC. And finally, I would like to ask Muaz Mustafa to join us, who was born and raised in Damascus, Syria, before moving to America at the age of 12. He is the executive director of the Syrian Syrian Emergency Task Force, where he advocates on behalf of pro-democratic movement inside Syria, provide aid to millions in need of humanitarian crisis, and to build a system of civilian councils to help with transitional governments. Thank you very much again for joining us. To be honest, it's not easy. Aleppo is my city. I did an exam. My high school exam is one of the schools here, so it's like very emotional. So first time I saw that movie, I cried, and this is my second time, and I still have the same worst feeling. I would like to welcome my panelists again, and I will start with Muaz. Last week you were in Syria for responding to emergency. Can you tell us about the situation there and the current situation on the ground and your sense towards what's going on right now?
First of all, I really want to thank One Journey and NYU for having us here, and I'm honored to be on this amazing panel. I've known Suzanne and her family, and they're all fantastic and have been doing amazing humanitarian work. I want to thank all of you for what you do and for having me here. I want to thank all of you for being here so late tonight. I know this is a very tough thing to watch. I just got back from the region where I had a chance to meet with some internally displaced people and refugees that are right along the border and see what the situation is right now, especially at the heels of the latest announcement by the White House in terms of a precipitous U.S. pullout. But I want to just speak. I think one thing that stuck with me is I usually go to this rehab center that it's in Turkey, and it allows people from IDPs to come out for treatment, and then they go back to Syria. And I saw this little girl that I had seen the last time I was there, and it's amazing. She's made so much progress, but she's about 9 years old. She's burned completely from head to toe, along with her little sister, who's also completely burned. And just the joy in her eyes as I was giving her some letters that that people here in the United States had written for them. In the way that she held me, I could almost still feel her little fingers. They were pressed so hard. She was just so happy that someone was there that cared about what's happening, that was telling them, her family, others that are there, that people in America and people across the world do care about what's going on. They feel so alone when you see them in these besieged areas, in these, and inside the opposition-held areas of Syria. I could tell you that the morale is down, that people see the Assad regime continuing with its brutality. Russian Air Force continues to bomb today as we speak. Iranian forces continue to shell civilian neighborhoods in all areas that are free of regime control. And the economic situation is horrible. It was cold while I was over there. The flooding in the refugee camps and the IDP camps is horrendous. I don't know how anyone could survive or live. Yet despite all of that, one thing that I think was powerful is, you ask these people, why are you in the situation that you're in today? And I know it's incredibly complex, right? Syria, you think of all the different players and so on, but to them it's really simple. It's that they wanted their dignity, they wanted their freedom, they wanted their universal rights that they deserve, just like you all do and we do anywhere in the world. And as a result of them asking for it, and as a result of an international community that wanted to turn away from this violence and wanted to just act like it's not happening or not do anything about it except mere statements, they're subjected to this sort of horrible misery. So I could tell you the situation, from what I saw, was incredibly depressing. People are continuing to suffer, and the amount of violence continues to increase, especially at a time when people like Assad, Russia, and Iran believe that U.S. and the West are leaving Syria to its fate, giving a blank check to continue this horrible killing at a more massive scale than even before.
We can't say anything, but we have our hopes. I have still my family still in there in Aleppo, and many of the people I know there. Let's go back to the humanitarian prospect. I would like to ask Suzanne now. You work with the Syrians who come here for resettling, and since as you can see in the movie, it's always hard to decide whether to resist and stay or whether to have to flee. So what is your intake on the film? Can you tell us what do you see how the struggle between staying in the city you love and wanting to be buried or leaving that place?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for One Journey for having me, and for NYU Washington, D.C. For hosting this wonderful film, and thank you to everyone who organized this event. Two of my board members who work with Accenture and are part of One Journey, Sohaila and Firas, I don't know if they're here still or not. We started the organization in 2015 knowing that Syrian refugees would be resettled in the U.S., and Chicago is a hub for refugees from many conflicts. It was very difficult to watch this film because I feel like I've been traumatized. I need a therapy session right now. Many of the families who came to Chicago escaped similar situations to these. Some of the earlier families that came in 2015 came from the city of Homs, my city, at the time when Baba Amr was being bombed. I don't know if you remember in 2014, 2012, 2013, Homs was being bombed all the time, and Baba Amr was besieged. And so the very first families that came to Chicago came from that area, and they talked about, the shelling, the bombing, the constant raids, the young men being dragged, taken to prison, and once these young men or young women who are activists who were trying to help or save people, once they're taken to prison, they'll never come back. Those pictures that they were looking at, the phones, those are from the person who was in the army. His code name was Caesar, and he took out those, the films of the prisoners. And many of the families who are in Chicago were looking through those pictures when they were first released, hoping to find their brother, find their son, find their uncle, their father. I mean, imagine going through that. It's really terrible. And so many of them have this guilt that they're in the U.S., and they worry about their family constantly and thinking about what's going on. This is an ongoing crisis, so that means you're constantly being bombarded with footage and messages from your family that they're desperate and that they wish they could leave. And Many of them say, coming to the United States was so hard. In the beginning, they were always, oh, maybe we should have stayed. I wish we stayed. This is so hard coming here. But now that many of the families have been here for 3 or 4 years, they're, oh, thank God we left. This is now the sentiment that as they're adjusting and, being helped. And many of the people who have helped in Chicago were people from the Jewish community, from the Christian community, the Arab Muslim community, rushed to help everyone, to support, and, seeing the footage, seeing the kids drown in the sea, when the picture of Aylan Kurdi came out, and all the pictures of people drowning, because, again, people would rather put their children in the boat and take a chance to flee to safety than have to endure, being bombed like that and being stuck under rubble. I mean, it's just a terrible situation. So the families that, to go back to your question, they do feel the sense of guilt because it's an ongoing crisis. And myself, as an American, Syrian American, I came here at the age of 10 in 1982. And at that time in Syria, there was the first uprising. But that uprising was quickly, squashed by the regime forces. And my mother, who at that time, my mother's not Syrian, my mother's Canadian, decided that she couldn't take it anymore, and she wanted to, come back to the United States to live with her family. And that's why we came here. But I mean, just living through that, hearing like the sounds of bullets and tanks, when from my own childhood, it never leaves you. And so I always worry about the children who have been resettled. That will this crisis come back to them in their later years? This trauma that they carry with them of seeing their neighbors or family members who've gone through this, or they themselves have gone through these types of situations. So it really is a difficult moment, but very hopeful that people who come here as refugees, they will begin a new chapter. Their children will be educated. The hope is for the children that they'll be the next doctors, the future entrepreneurs, the future businessmen and women. And this is what America is all about.
I have to agree with you. Like when I moved to the US like 5 years ago, I also have struggled, like feel guilt, like I left everyone else to be here, and I still have this dreaming of coming back one day after the war is over. But I already built my life, and actually it's not easy. But I'm maybe one of the lucky people who actually end up in the state by a fellowship or something, but there are millions of Syrian are on the borders in camps, and they are mainly helped by international agencies and local communities such UNHCR. So Jayna, if you can tell us more about what the UNHCR is doing in those areas and how they are helping the refugees there, and what is your intake regarding the movies and also regarding the situation in Syria.
Sure, thank you. And I'd just like to add my thank you to the One Journey Festival and NYU and all of you for coming out on a weekday late at night. It was not an easy movie to watch. It's also very humbling and not easy to talk after the movie. But we do have to talk about it, and I'm glad you all came here for that reason. In March, we'll be acknowledging the 8th anniversary of the war, which means some of us have been now for 8 years on panels talking about Syria. Suzanne and I were on a panel together a few years ago. I would have hoped long before now that we wouldn't be on panels talking about Syria. I certainly hope we're not talking about the 9th and 10th anniversary. But in the meantime, we have to continue focusing on it. UNHCR, for those of you who don't know, generally leads the international response with a lot of partners. We don't do anything alone. With a lot of NGO partners and other UN agencies and governmental partners, we tend to lead the response to refugee situations, which is when people have crossed a border into Turkey, Iraq, Jordan, Lebanon, and have become refugees. We also, with other UN agencies, respond to the situation of IDPs, internally displaced persons, in this case Syrians. We were in Syria before the war, largely working with Iraqis and other refugees there. So when the Syrian conflict started, we turned our attention to assisting displaced Syrians. We've remained there, working all over the country wherever we had access. Obviously, our access has been limited at certain times to certain places, but we have worked with partners both in regime-held areas and rebel-held areas, negotiating with whatever actors on the ground we had to negotiate with to get access. And we continue to do that. There are still over 6 million IDPs in Syria. Over 1 million of them, you can tell me better, are still in hard-to-reach areas. Obviously, significant violence continues in certain areas of the country. Now you have flooding and other issues as well. At the same time, we have, I think the current number is 5.6, 5.7 million registered Syrian refugees in the neighboring countries. The largest number, 3.7 million in Turkey, but about 1 million in Lebanon, and the impact is felt tremendously in Lebanon. I was there in late September and in Turkey briefly in early October, and I can tell you Lebanon is about 1/3 the size of Maryland, and they're hosting 1 million Syrians out of a pre-war population of 4 million Lebanese. So when I was there in late September, the message, much more so than the last time I had been there a couple years ago, was all the Syrians need to go home yesterday. I mean, the pressure there is tremendous in Lebanon. At the same time, they continue to host them. In Turkey, even though many more Syrians, the country's a lot bigger, the pressures are less. Not so much they need to go home, but don't forget about us, we still need assistance. Jordan hosts about 670,000 registered. Iraq, mostly northern Iraq, about 250,000. Egypt, about 130,000, and then others scattered around. So our main concern right now as the UN Refugee Agency is that these hosting countries, these hosting communities, because the impact, just like in the US, national politicians talk about it, but the impact is always felt at the local level. These host communities, in order to keep their doors open, in order to not send refugees back prematurely, need continued and increased assistance from the international community, from the World Bank, other financial institutions, economic actors, development actors. It's not the time to stop international assistance. At the same time, the Syrian refugees, like refugees elsewhere, need to be empowered so that they don't continue to need to be dependent on assistance. They can be agents of their own change if they can work illegally, if they can send their kids to school. So we're advocating for that. But the second main issue is it's not the time, it's still too premature to be talking about organized returns. We know some refugees have gone home spontaneously, some IDPs have gone home, and we will help them if we can. But the message is this is not the time yet. Understandably, people are concerned for their safety, so we need to continue providing aid at the same time we look to the future for when that time comes.
I think every Syrian's dream is to go back to his country, and if he can't, or if she can't, maybe there is really some issues regarding his safety or something like that. So we all hope that one day all of us can be returning there, or at least visiting that country. I think we have more time for a couple of questions. So there is mics, and you can just introduce your name and ask your question, and if you are addressing someone or it's a general question. I think there is one back.
Hello, my name is Mariam Zia, and I'm a student at University of Maryland. Actually, after watching the movie, I just felt that there are 3 actors which are being held responsible for this crisis, namely Russia, Assad regime, and Iran. But as someone coming from a conflict area myself, I would say that if we mention other actors in perpetuating this conflict, like United States and other Western countries, maybe our story would be more complete. We would be able to present a better picture, a better solution. So I want to say that can you comment the role of other actors like United States on perpetuating this war for this long? Thank you so much.
So she was asking about the role of the United States. So who will be?
Take it. So good question. And you're right. In that video, you see 3 actors mainly that are perpetuating this conflict, that are causing the biggest amount of deaths. But let's look at all the actors. And Syria is incredibly complex. So there is now, over this 8 years, a ton. But before we do that, I think it's important to just go back in time. Go back to 2011 in March. It was children, the same victims that you see here, the biggest victims of this war, that wrote on their walls what they saw on TV. They wrote things like freedom, democracy, and they wrote, "It's your turn, doctor," referring to the dictator in Damascus. Those kids in Daraa, in that southern town, were taken and tortured. Initially, no one was protesting the end of the regime. People went to the governor of that province and said, "We want accountability for what happened to our kids." And the response was, "Go home and make new ones." That's the amount of dignity that is given to the Syrian people by their government, by their regime. The other actors on the ground, there are rebel groups, opposition groups that are fighting. Initially, they started as defectors from the regime's army itself, which didn't want to shoot at their own people, didn't want to shoot at protesters. As time went on, extremists came into the conflict. So you have things like ISIS. By the way, ISIS attacked who? Attacked the rebels first, primarily. You could look it up on YouTube. You can go through anything. And understood that to them, the biggest existential threat to extremists are the regular Muslims in the country that did not want these horrible ideas. The regime saw the biggest threat to it as the civilians, the pro-democracy protesters, because he wants to look at the world and say, it's either me or ISIS. But that's not true. Both of these horrible extremists from one side and the other were going after the same Syrian people. My organization, an American organization, we lost 4 of our staff, like brothers to me. 2 beheaded by ISIS, and 2 killed by Iran and the regime, tortured to death. That's just a microcosm of what goes on. And just to be fair, let's look at the US's role. The United States came in, not because of the mass massacre of hundreds of thousands. It came in because 2 American journalists, some of us knew them, had gone to Syria to cover the plight of the Syrian people. They were beheaded very publicly by ISIS, which mobilized the United States and an international coalition to go after ISIS specifically, a very specific role, not to deter the regime from what it's doing, the torture to death of hundreds of thousands. By the way, I invite each one of you, if you're in Washington, D.C., go to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. There is an exhibit that's been on since we started working with them in 2014 that shows the torture to death that happens. That was documented by a regime photographer, a photographer that worked for 25 years in the regime itself, and so bravely snuck out 55,000 pictures of men, women, children, and elderly that have been tortured to death, including Christians, Arabs, Kurds, Alawites, the whole mosaic of the Syrian people. But there is a fault to the United States in the way that it conducted its war on ISIS. It conducted massive bombing campaigns in places like Raqqa and Mosul that resulted in the deaths of civilians. Towards the end of the Obama administration, permissions were given to local commanders, and this was upheld by the Trump administration, to conduct greater attacks without White House or Washington approving, which would usually limit collateral damage. And so places like Raqqa, liberated from ISIS, were completely, they looked like Dresden after World War II. But if you look at the #1 cause of death for the Syrian people, the over 500,000 the United Nations stopped counting, so that's a conservative estimate. If you look at the 300,000 people that are in jails, 55,000 people documented by one photographer, 55,000 pictures by one photographer in one city in 2.5 years, a snapshot both in time and in geography. Of what happens in all these different jails, including jails that hold families of many of us here. If you ask any of these people in the IDP camps, if you ask any of these people in the refugee camps, 4 million, by the way, internally displaced today in Idlib province, getting bombed by Russia and the Assad regime and Iranian shelling. 1 million of them children. There are 55,000 in the...
I have to interrupt you.
Sorry.
We need to have a couple of more questions. Can you give the gentleman here, sir? I know, I had to interrupt Muaz, I'm sorry, but I know that the movie make us, all of us, emotionally, on so many levels.
I just want to say that by far, the #1 killer of civilians is the Assad regime and the Russian carpet bombing. No one else is bombing, and the rebels don't have
the question was more about the other international factors, like the U.S. involved.
No, I think this is a really important to push this outside the frame and the narrative that you're establishing, because that's a problem. and the world has to deal with this because this became a cliche. Kids were protesting, the regime overreacted. Obviously, they did, and then there's a big gap because besides the U.S., I think the thing that we need to mention and you need to take into account is Saudi Arabia and the Emiratis.
I would have to.
Emiratis.
I would have to say something.
You're censoring now.
Can I? No. Actually, I would have to say something. As One Journey, our job here and our mission here is to focus on the crisis of the people in need, the vulnerable people. So a blaming part, it's not our job here to blame anyone. It's not like we are not in position of power to blame or to judge anyone. Sure, it's like different narration by different people. I know. Let
me just say one thing.
But I would like to say something here.
The film is very political.
Yeah, I know.
It's a form of disaster pornography, and it's really targeted to avoid asking the right questions. Forget it. I just want to ask the UN question. Can I?
Okay. Yes.
Okay. So now we're in a different phase. The best thing is for Syrians to go back to Syria and to deal with this in a reconciliation mode. What are the steps that the UN is taking in that direction?
Yeah, and I'm not trying to dodge any question, just that I'm not here speaking for the UN, which is a huge entity. I can only speak for the UN Refugee Agency, which is purely a humanitarian agency, so I'm glad we have others that can speak to the politics. What I can say is that I know this, because the situation is still going on, and because the actors you were talking about are still there, that the issue of rebuilding and reconstruction in Syria is a very fraught political issue. And understandably, some governments will have difficulty putting resources into certain areas of Syria to rebuild. What I can say is that right now, as some Syrian refugees and internally displaced are, for their own reasons, testing the waters and returning to some areas, whether it's their original home area or another area that they want to reestablish themselves if their homes are no longer there, or in some cases because life in the host countries is just pretty unbearable. And so they choose to go back. Small numbers relatively, but it's starting to happen spontaneously. We don't encourage it. We don't think time is right for large-scale organized return. When that time is right, we'll be very involved in helping people go back. But at this point, we're not involved formally, but when people tell us they want to return, we try to monitor the returns to make sure it is voluntary, because key to us is nobody should be forced. So we assess the voluntariness, and if we're convinced it is voluntary, we try to give them some limited support at the area where they're leaving, and then in Syria, if we have access to where they're going, we hope that our colleagues there can follow up to see what's happened to them and see if their needs are being met. We're not a development agency. We will never have the resources ourselves for large-scale reconstruction, but as part of what we do anywhere in the world, when refugees go home, we try to give them limited initial assistance that they need so that they have something to go back to in order to help reestablish themselves. So we'll be calling on international support to help refugees in the return process and reintegration, which is very different than large-scale reconstruction of Syria. Now, if international actors are committed to large-scale reconstruction when that time is right, then you'll have the UN Development Program, and in the US you'd have AID, and again, the World Bank, hopefully, and other actors coming in. At this point, we're concerned about the individual human scale returns in order to have something to go back to. But again, to be clear, we don't feel the time is right at a large scale for that yet. But we always have to be doing contingency planning, just like right now, we're doing contingency planning potentially for further outflows, depending on what happens with latest developments.
Okay. Do you want to add something?
No, I just wanted to add to Jayna's comment that there have been some refugees who did go back from Lebanon and were actually killed, who were captured by regime forces, and they were killed, and saying, punishing them for leaving in the first place. Well, I mean, I don't understand why they would do that when it was so unbearable to live in Syria anyway, and they left because they wanted to keep their families safe. And I just wanted to add also the role of the United States is that early on, when the gas attack happened in 2013 in Damascus, in Ghouta, and 1,400 souls died, our government also chose not to do anything. So that is also part of the U.S. policy, is that when we saw something terrible really happen, we kind of just sat on our hands. But when it became something about ISIS or Islamic whatever or this and that, and there were some other interests in hand, we took action, and we didn't care about the permission of Congress or whatever. But for the gas attack, for the 1,400 people who passed away, many of them women and children, we chose not to do anything and blamed Congress. Oh, they didn't give us permission. So this was a huge, huge mistake on the part of the United States. And I believe, this is my opinion, my personal opinion, and even Secretary Kerry wrote about this in his biography, saying that this was a turning point, and that we abdicated our power, our diplomatic power in the world, to bring people to justice and to just kind of ignore the problem. Hopefully it will just go away.
I think we only have time for one more last question. I think there.
Hopefully just the question you're looking for, what are the organizations you'd most encourage us to donate to help people, the refugee community outside of Syria and those in Syria, and then local organizations in the DC area, what can we do that's most helpful?
Actually, it was like my question here, like how can we help? Like people after they see that they want to do something, like contribute. So like in few seconds, each one of you can like recommend something or beside your organizations.
I'm going to recommend my organization.
Obvious, like, so if you can like, how people here, they can participate and can help the people in need. Let's start with you.
Okay, so of course donate to my organization, the Syrian Community Network. I'm biased, but of course donate to UNHCR and the Syria Task Force and to many other organizations who are doing amazing work on the ground. One of them is Med Global, that's doing work in Lebanon, and they've gone to Bangladesh for the Rohingya refugees and for many other things. But I just want to add that Syria is small in size, but really cosmic in its effect of what happened. It changed the world. We have a refugee crisis that is unprecedented. So all of us can take action. We can push our communities to advocate, to be more proactive in ending this war. All of us we can pick up the phone and call our congresswomen, our congressmen, our senators, and to advocate and to help local refugees in your communities, to advocate to, releasing the children who are caged at the border, to not build the wall. All of these issues are all tied together, and many of them were sparked because of Syria, because Syria brought in the anti-refugee, anti-immigrant, xenophobia, Brexit, and the election of President Trump, who ran on this promise that he will not allow Syrian refugees, he will not allow Mexicans to come into the United States. So advocacy is really key, and support your local organizations here in the United States.
I would like to ask Jayna.
Yeah, the one thing about the Syrian response, whether it's inside Syria or the region, there's no shortage of credible non-governmental organizations working on this. I mean, all the big ones that you hear about, CARE, Mercy Corps, Save the Children, Doctors Without Borders, they're probably somewhere in the region. And it would not be difficult to find one that you have a connection with. International Committee of the Red Cross, a lot doing tremendous work. Again, Med Global, familiar with them. But I would echo what Suzanne said. You can also do a lot with communities in the U.S. I started my career many years ago in refugee resettlement. Even though only a tiny fraction of refugees ever make it to the U.S. or a resettlement country, they're really important, not only because their families now have found safety, but because then they become a bridge to educating people about what's happening back home. So if you Google Refugee Council USA, you'll see a list of agencies that are helping refugees resettle in communities all over the U.S.
I would suggest something called the wisdomhouseproject.com. This is a school for orphans and a women's center and a theater troupe inside Syria. The internally displaced people, like the ones in Idlib, there's no access for UNHCR or any major UN organ in these areas. The School for Orphans, this women's center, and the theater troupe are supported by non-Syrian Americans from Arkansas, Florida, other places. It's a really beautiful thing. So thewisdomhouseproject.com. There's also, during that siege of Aleppo that you saw in the movie, which you missed, by the way, you should watch it before calling it pornography. It's really really important to know that during that siege, with those bombs, they were sending down flyers that said, "The world has left you to your slaughter. You're all alone." So there's a program called Letters of Hope for Syria. It's free. You just write a letter, you give it to us, we deliver it inside the country, and I can tell you these letters mean the world to them. It's as if you've given them $1 million, because they know that they're not alone. Thank you all so much for listening.
I have here to be biased and also say, if you want to help, you can also join us at One Journey. So you can help us to change the narration about refugees, because we might be, like, as Syrian, we are always talking about the Syrian crisis, but like refugees are all over the world, and it's a huge crisis. So we need to change that narration, especially among our other people. The wall, all these kind of things, it's based on the fact that refugees are no longer welcome in the US, which is not an American value. So we can follow us on Twitter, you can join us, you can volunteer if you have time, and you can participate in our events like this. At the end, I would like to thank our panel here for their participation. Also, I would like to thank our sponsors, Cava for food, Artisan and Vines for the wine, Point of View documentary for the movie that you have seen, and finally, the New York University for giving us this amazing place. Thank you very much for being here, and you can join us at the reception outside after this event.